I'm Colonel Jesse Stone, 46 years old, and I started as a 22-year-old second lieutenant fresh out of ROTC, one of only 3 women in my class to qualify in advanced marksmanship. For years, I worked twice as hard, stayed twice as late, and proved myself 100 different ways to people who still thought skill came with a gender. But when a senior officer, Colonel Whitaker, mocked me in front of 60 recruits and told me to show them what I've got, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been underestimated or humiliated by someone you gave your absolute best to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to make you small, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about reclaiming your worth and holding the line. What happened next might surprise you. I joined the Air Force at 22, a newly commissioned second lieutenant fresh out of ROTC with my degree still warm in my hand and no real idea what I was walking into. I was one of only 3 women in my class to qualify in advanced marksmanship. That felt like something then. Like proof. Like I'd earned a seat at a table I didn't yet understand was always being moved. The first time I held an M4 carbine, I remember thinking how much heavier it was than the rifle I'd trained with in college. The M4 weighs just over 7 pounds loaded, but it felt like more than that. It felt like responsibility. I learned every technical detail, how to field strip it in under a minute, how to clear a malfunction without looking, how the direct impingement gas system worked and why it mattered. I did the same with the M9 Beretta, the standard issue sidearm, 15-round magazine, double action first pull. I could recite the specs in my sleep. But what I really learned in those early years was how to stay silent when underestimated. It started small. An instructor would demonstrate a shooting stance and then glance at me, almost apologetic, and say, "You might want to widen your base a little more. Center of gravity's different for you." I'd nod. Adjust. Qualify expert anyway. There was this unspoken assumption that I was working against my own body, that marksmanship for me was compensation rather than skill. I didn't argue. I just kept my scores high and my mouth shut. By my mid-20s, I was a first lieutenant running range safety briefs and assisting with weapons qualifications. I'd watch male officers, some of whom couldn't hit a stationary target at 50 meters, get congratulated on their natural ability, while my own scores were met with surprise, as if they needed to be explained. "You must practice a lot," they'd say. I did. But so did everyone else. The difference was that for them, practice was dedication. For me, it was necessity. I made captain at 27, then major at 32. 04. Field grade officer. By then, I'd put in a decade. I knew the regulations front to back, had logged hundreds of hours on ranges across 3 continents, and had become the kind of officer younger troops actually listened to, not because I was loud, but because I was right. I'd earned my place as a weapons specialist and range safety officer. I'd done everything the manual said to do. That's when I met Colonel James Whitaker. He was 06, a full-bird colonel with enough ribbons on his chest to tell a career's worth of stories. He'd been brought in to lead a new joint training initiative, something ambitious involving inter-service collaboration and updated combat readiness standards. I was assigned as his senior staff officer for marksmanship programs. On paper, it was a good fit. In practice, it was the beginning of something I didn't see coming. At first, I respected him. I wanted to. Colonel Whitaker had a reputation as a brilliant tactician, someone who could see 3 moves ahead in a training exercise and adjust doctrine on the fly. In our early meetings, he was sharp, focused, almost professorial. We'd spend hours planning readiness drills, reviewing after-action reports, debating the merit of different qualification standards. I felt like I was learning, like I was being mentored. "You've got a good eye for this, Stone," he said once, leaning back in his chair after I'd walked him through a revised scoring matrix. "Most officers treat marksmanship like a checklist. You actually understand it." I remember feeling proud, seen. But over the next several months, the tone shifted. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as banter, as the rough camaraderie that came with military culture. He started calling me lieutenant, even after I'd pinned on major. When I corrected him once, he laughed. Old habits, he said. But he kept doing it. Relax, Lieutenant, he'd say during briefings, even though I outranked half the room by then. You shoot fine for someone your size. It didn't sting then. Or maybe it did, and I just didn't let myself feel it. I still thought I had to prove I belonged. I still thought competence was currency. The comments came more often when others were around. In private, he was cordial, even complimentary. But in front of the junior officers, the NCOs, the visiting brass, he'd slip into this other version of himself, louder, looser, performing. And I was part of the performance. Major Stone here is our resident expert, he announced once at a staff meeting, his tone hovering somewhere between admiration and amusement. She can tell you the muzzle velocity of an M4 down to the foot per second. Ask her anything. Just don't ask her to carry the ammo crate. The room laughed. I smiled. That's what you did. Looking back, I can see it clearly. But at the time, I told myself it was harmless. That he didn't mean anything by it. That I was being too sensitive. Women in the military get good at that, at making themselves smaller in their own minds, so they can stay functional in the room. I kept working. I kept training. I ran live-fire exercises, updated safety protocols, rewrote portions of our qualification standards to reflect actual combat conditions rather than parade ground theatrics. I stayed late, showed up early, made sure my work was airtight. Because that's what competence does. It keeps receipts. I thought if I was good enough, it would speak for itself. I thought respect was something you could earn by being undeniable. I didn't yet understand that for some people, your competence isn't threatening because they doubt it. It's threatening because they believe it. And belief requires a response. The question was what kind. Colonel Whitaker and I spent hours in the same rooms, reviewing the same reports, solving the same problems. We were building something together, new standards, better training, a system that would outlast both of us. I believed in the work. I believed in him, or at least in the version of him I wanted to see. But late at night, alone in my office with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and a cold cup of coffee going stale on my desk, I'd replay certain moments. The jokes that landed just wrong. The way he'd talk over me in meetings, then restate my point 5 minutes later as if it were his own. The way his mentorship felt less like guidance and more like performance, something he could point to later as evidence of his fairness, his open-mindedness. I didn't have the language for it yet. I just knew that something had changed. And I didn't know if it was him, or me, or the space between us. What I did know was this. I was a major in the United States Air Force. I was a weapons specialist with expert-level qualifications and a decade of spotless evaluations. I had done everything right. And somehow, that wasn't enough. By the time I pinned on Major, I thought things would be different. That's the lie we tell ourselves, that rank will protect you, that authority is a shield. But rank doesn't change how people see you. It just gives them a new framework for the same old dismissal. Colonel Whitaker's banter grew louder, bolder. And it was always, when others were listening. Don't let Major Stone handle the heavy recoil. He joked to the younger officers during a pre-brief, gesturing at me like I was a piece of equipment that needed a warning label. We'd hate to see her manicure chip. The room would laugh. Not cruelly, not maliciously, just enough to signal they'd heard him, that they were part of the moment. I'd laugh too, because that was easier than the alternative. That's what we did. We minimized. We made ourselves complicit in our own diminishment because the cost of objecting was always higher than the cost of enduring. But there were small moments that told a different truth. Moments that didn't happen in front of an audience. He'd forget to copy me on readiness briefings I'd helped design. I'd find out about meetings an hour after they'd ended, then get asked why I hadn't attended. When I'd submit an analysis report, something I'd spent days on, cross-referencing data from 4 different bases, he'd delegate it to a captain with half my experience to take a look before it went up the chain. My work filtered through someone else's credibility. I started to notice a pattern. In public, I was the example, proof of the colonel's progressive leadership, his willingness to elevate women in technical roles. In private, I was provisional. My expertise was useful, but my authority was negotiable. The senior staff started echoing his tone. It was subtle, the way culture spreads, less like a directive and more like osmosis. A major I'd worked with for years stopped asking my opinion in planning sessions. A chief master sergeant who used to defer to me on range protocols began double-checking my calls with the colonel, as if I needed a second signature. "You're good, Stone," one of them told me after a briefing, his tone friendly but pointed. But maybe not combat good, you know? I didn't know. I had the same qualifications as anyone in that room. I'd been deployed. I'd run live-fire exercises under conditions that made some of these men nervous. But somewhere along the way, the narrative had shifted. I wasn't the weapons specialist anymore. I was the female weapons specialist. And that adjective changed everything. I didn't realize then that the colonel's mockery wasn't personal. It wasn't even about me. It was cultural, a way to remind everyone where power lived, who held it, and what happened when someone outside the traditional mold started to look too competent. Still, I trained harder. Stayed later. Shot cleaner. I ran live-fire drills in rain and heat and cold until my hands cramped. I memorized not just the standards, but the exceptions, the edge cases, the scenarios that didn't fit neatly into doctrine. I became the person you called when something went wrong on the range, when a weapon malfunctioned, when a trainee panicked and someone needed to de-escalate fast. I thought if I could just be undeniable, it would matter. I thought competence kept receipts. And it does. But receipts don't mean anything if no one's willing to audit the books. One afternoon, I was reviewing qual scores in my office when Captain Riley Chin knocked on the doorframe. She was one of the younger officers, sharp and ambitious, someone I'd worked with on a few training rotations. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" She stepped inside, hesitant. "Of course." She closed the door. That's when I knew it wasn't a tactical question. "Do you ever feel like..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Like you have to be twice as good just to be taken seriously?" I looked at her. She was 28 and 03. Still knew enough to believe the system would reward merit. I envied that a little. "Every day," I said. She nodded slowly. I see how he talks to you. Colonel Whitaker. And I don't understand it. You're the best shot on this base. Everyone knows it." "It's not about the shooting," I told her. "Then what's it about?" I didn't have a good answer. Or maybe I had too many. "It's about reminding people of the hierarchy," I said finally. "Not the one in the regulation. The other one." She sat with that for a moment, and I could see her deciding whether to believe me. Whether to let that truth in, or keep pretending the system was fair. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "some of us see it." After she left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the spreadsheet on my screen. Rows and rows of scores, names, qualifications. Data that should have been objective. But I knew better now. I knew that no amount of data could protect you from a story someone had already decided to tell. I thought about all the late shifts. All the reports I'd rewritten to make them bulletproof. All the qualifications I'd redone for optics because someone higher up thought it would look better if I proved myself one more time. Just one more time. It hit me, sitting in that quiet office with the fluorescent lights buzzing and the air conditioning rattling in the vent, that my restraint, my professionalism, my silence, had protected everyone but me. I'd absorbed every joke, every dismissal, every casual piece of disrespect, and I'd told myself it was strategy. That I was picking my battles. That I was being smart. But there's a difference between strategy and surrender. And I'd been surrendering for years. That night, I stayed late again. Not because I had to, but because I didn't know what else to do. I cleaned my sidearm, methodically, the way I'd done 1,000 times. Field strip, inspect, oil, reassemble. Muscle memory. The kind of task that doesn't require thought, just repetition. I thought about Colonel Whitaker. About the way he looked at me in that first meeting, nodding as I walked him through my analysis. The way he'd said, "You actually understand this." I thought about how much I'd wanted that to be true. How much I'd wanted him to see me. And I realized, finally, that he did see me. He just didn't respect what he saw. That was the part I'd been avoiding. The part that hurt more than the jokes, more than the exclusion. It wasn't ignorance. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was choice. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. It happened during a base demonstration for new recruits, an open-range evaluation designed to showcase what qual standards looked like in practice. The kind of event where senior leadership stands around looking authoritative while the younger enlisted personnel try not to look nervous. I wasn't scheduled to shoot. I was supervising. That was my role that day, range safety officer, clipboard in hand, making sure no one did anything stupid with a loaded weapon. I'd done it 100 times. It was routine. The range was full. 2 platoons of trainees, maybe 60 people total, lined up behind the firing line with their weapons slung and their faces showing that particular mix of focus and anxiety that comes right before live fire. Colonel Whitaker was there along with a handful of other senior officers, observing from the safety area behind the tower. The drill was simple. Trainees would move to the line in groups of 10, fire a prescribed sequence at stationary targets 50 meters out, then clear their weapons and move off. Standard qualification stuff. I'd walked the line twice already, checking stances, correcting trigger discipline, making sure nobody was about to shoot themselves in the foot. Everything was going fine until one of the trainees, a kid, maybe 19, skinny and pale with sweat already soaking through his uniform, fumbled his weapon during the reload. The magazine clattered to the ground. He bent to pick it up, and his muzzle swept left, crossing 2 other shooters. I was on him in seconds. Cease fire. Weapon down. Step back. His hands were shaking. The whole line had gone quiet. "You're okay," I said, low enough that only he could hear. "Just breathe. Pick up the mag, seat it properly, and we'll reset." He nodded, gulping air, and did what I told him. Crisis averted. No harm done. Just a nervous trainee making a nervous mistake. That should have been the end of it. But Colonel Whitaker had walked down from the observation area, hands in his pockets, that easy grin on his face that I'd learned to distrust. "Everything all right, Major?" he called out, loud enough to carry across the range. "Yes, sir. Just a procedural reset." He stepped closer, still grinning. The kind of grin that wasn't about humor, it was about audience. And we had one. 60 trainees, half a dozen officers, all watching. "You know," he said, his voice pitched for the crowd, "I think the problem is these kids don't have a good example to follow. They need to see what right looks like." I kept my expression neutral. "We have qualified instructors on the line, sir." Sure. He waved that off. "But none of them are a resident expert, are they?" He turned to the trainees, sweeping his arm toward me like a game show host revealing a prize. "Major Stone here is the best shot on this base. At least, that's what she keeps telling us." I'd never said that. Not once. But the lie was already out there, reframing everything. "Show us what you've got, princess," he said. The laughter hit harder than the words. Not mean laughter, just the reflexive kind, the kind that happens when someone in authority makes a joke and you're supposed to play along. But it landed like a slap. I felt the heat in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just the sudden, clarifying realization that this was never about skill. It was theater. I was a prop in a performance designed to remind me, where I stood. I could have refused. I could have cited protocol, pointed out that I was the range safety officer and wasn't in the duty rotation. I could have done any number of things that would have been technically correct and professionally disastrous. Instead, I said nothing. I stepped to the line. Took the M4 from the stand. Checked the chamber, checked the magazine, seated it with a sharp click. The weight of the rifle settled into my hands like something I'd been born holding. The range had gone silent. 60 people watching. Waiting. I didn't look at Whitaker. I didn't look at anyone. I just looked downrange at the targets, black silhouettes on white backdrops, stark and simple and 50 meters out. I flipped the selector to semi-auto. Exhaled. And fired. The first shot was center mass. The second, the same. I moved to the next target without pausing, my breathing steady, my hands precise. Trigger pull, recoil, reset. Trigger pull, recoil, reset. I didn't think. I didn't need to. This was muscle memory layered over a decade of repetitions, of early mornings on ranges in Georgia and Nevada and Germany, of proving over and over again that I belonged in rooms that didn't want me. 12 seconds. That's how long it took. 12 seconds to put rounds through every target on the line. 12 seconds of perfect, methodical violence. The last casing ejected with a metallic clink, and I safetied the weapon. The range was so quiet I could hear the brass rolling on the concrete behind me. I turned, handed the rifle back to the rack. My hands weren't shaking. Colonel Whitaker was staring at me. Not grinning anymore. Just staring, his face blank in a way that looked almost like confusion. "Who are you?" he said quietly. Like he'd forgotten. Like he'd never actually looked before. I met his eyes. Held them. "Your range safety officer, sir." I didn't wait for a response. I turned back to the line, picked up my clipboard, and motioned for the next group of trainees to step up. Behind me, I heard someone exhale. Heard the low murmur of voices starting up again, the way sound returns after a held breath. But I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see their faces to know what I'd just done. I'd answered the question. Not the one he'd asked. The one underneath it. The one that had been hanging in the air for months, maybe years. "Can you do this?" "Yes." "Do you belong here?" "Yes." "Are you good enough?" "I just showed you." The rest of the demonstration continued without incident. The trainees shot their quals. The officers observed. Colonel Whitaker stayed in the observation tower, and when the exercise ended, he left without a word. I stayed until the last shooter cleared the line, until the brass was policed and the weapons were racked and the range was empty again. Then I walked back to my office, sat down at my desk, and stared at the wall. The look on his face kept replaying in my mind. That moment of blank confusion, like I'd become someone he didn't recognize. But I hadn't changed. I'd always been this. He just hadn't wanted to see it. And now he couldn't unsee it. I thought about all the times I'd stayed quiet. All the jokes I'd let slide, all the moments I'd swallowed my pride and called it professionalism. I thought about Captain Chin asking me if I ever felt like I had to be twice as good. The answer was yes. But here's what I hadn't told her. Being twice as good doesn't make them respect you. It just makes them resent you more quietly. Respect earned too late still feels like insult. I sat there in my office, alone, and let myself feel that. Not triumph. Not vindication. Just the cold, tired weight of knowing that I'd done everything right, and it still wasn't enough to change the thing that mattered most. The story. The story he'd been telling about me. The story I'd let him tell. That was over now. The story spread through the base by evening. I didn't have to hear it to know it was happening. I could see it in the way people looked at me. Some of them grinned. Some of them nodded. A few avoided eye contact entirely, like I'd done something vaguely inappropriate and they weren't sure how to process it. By the next morning, it had reached the other side of base. A logistics officer I barely knew stopped me outside the commissary. "Heard you put on a clinic yesterday, ma'am," he said, half smiling. 12 seconds. That true? Something like that. Damn. He shook his head, still smiling. Wish I'd seen it. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and kept walking. The thing about a story like that is it takes on a life of its own. It gets polished in the retelling, details added or stripped away depending on who's talking and what point they're trying to make. Some people framed it as a victory, proof that women could hold their own, that skill mattered more than assumptions. Others framed it as a spectacle, something entertaining but ultimately inconsequential. A few framed it as insubordination, though they didn't say that to my face. Colonel Whitaker never apologized. But his silence spoke volumes. He stopped joking around me altogether. Stopped calling me princess, stopped making comments about manicures or heavy recoil, or any of the small, cutting remarks that had been part of our interactions for months. In meetings, he was cordial, professional, distant. It should have felt like progress. But it didn't. It felt like I'd won something I shouldn't have had to fight for in the first place. That week, I sat alone in my office and thought about the years I'd spent trying to earn the approval of men who had no intention of giving it. Every late shift. Every report rewritten to make it airtight. Every qualification redone for optics, because someone higher up thought it would look better if I proved myself just one more time. I thought about all the things I'd tolerated because I believed endurance was strength. Because I thought if I could just outlast the skepticism, the doubt, the casual disrespect, Eventually, I'd be seen for what I was, competent, qualified, worthy of the rank I held. But that's not how it works. Endurance doesn't earn respect. It just teaches people how much you're willing to take. I'd been protecting everyone but myself. Absorbing every joke, every dismissal, every moment of being talked over or talked down to, and I'd told myself it was strategy. That I was being smart. That I was picking my battles. But I wasn't picking battles. I was avoiding them. And avoidance isn't neutrality. It's complicity. A senior master sergeant, a man named Daniel Barnes, stopped by my office one night about a week after the range incident. He was E8, late 30s, the kind of NCO who'd seen enough to know when to speak and when to stay quiet. He knocked on the door frame even though the door was open. "Ma'am, you got a minute?" "Of course, Sergeant Barnes. Come in." He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and stood there for a moment like he was deciding how to start. "I've been watching this for months," he said finally. "The way the colonel talked to you. The way some of the others started echoing it. I kept thinking someone was going to step in. Say something." I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. "You didn't just outshoot him," Barnes continued. "You outlasted him. That's harder." Something in my chest loosened. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed to hear that, not the praise, but the acknowledgement. That someone had seen it. That I hadn't imagined it. "Thank you, Sergeant." He nodded. "For what it's worth, ma'am, you changed the way a lot of people think about this stuff. Not everyone, but enough." After he left, I sat there in the quiet and let myself feel something I hadn't allowed in a long time: pride. Not the defensive kind, not the kind that comes from proving someone wrong. Just pride. Simple and clean and unqualified. I'd done the work. I'd held the line. And maybe that didn't fix the system, didn't change the culture, didn't undo years of being underestimated. But it mattered. To some people, it mattered. That was the first time I allowed myself to feel pride without guilt. The weeks that followed were strange. Colonel Whitaker kept his distance, but the dynamic between us had shifted in ways I couldn't quite name. In meetings, he deferred to me more often. When I made a recommendation, he didn't second-guess it or farm it out to someone else for validation. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't even respect, not really. It was recognition. A grudging acknowledgement that I knew what I was doing. It should have been enough. But I kept thinking about all the time we'd wasted. All the energy I'd spent managing his ego, navigating his moods, trying to anticipate which version of him would show up to any given meeting. I thought about the junior officers who'd watched that dynamic and learned from it, learned that this was how authority worked, that humiliation was just part of the culture, that you earned your place by enduring rather than by excelling. I started keeping a log. Nothing formal, just notes. Dates, times, witnesses. Instances where professionalism had slipped into something else. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just knew I needed to stop pretending it wasn't happening. One afternoon, I was walking past the base gym when I saw a group of trainees running drills outside. Among them was the kid who'd fumbled his weapon on the range, the one whose mistake had set the whole thing in motion. He was moving better now, more confident, his rifle no longer looking like an alien object in his hands. I stopped and watched for a moment. He caught my eye, straightened a little, and gave me a small nod. Not subservient. Just respectful. The way you acknowledge someone who didn't let you fail. I nodded back. Later, I thought about that moment. How something as small as not being humiliated in front of your peers could change the way you carried yourself. How the absence of cruelty could feel like kindness. That's what I wanted to build. Not a culture where people had to prove themselves by enduring abuse. A culture where competence was enough. Where you didn't have to be twice as good just to be seen as adequate. But I didn't know how to build that from where I was. I was one major in a system that had been running the same way for decades. I couldn't change it by shooting straight. I couldn't change it by staying quiet. So I started asking myself a different question. What would it take? That night, I pulled out the log I'd been keeping. Read through it, page by page. Saw the pattern laid out in ink. And I realized that the answer wasn't silence. It was documentation. When the annual readiness review came around 3 months later, I wrote my evaluation report honestly. Not vengefully, not emotionally, just honestly. I didn't name Colonel Whitaker specifically. I didn't have to. I documented patterns, repeated instances of unprofessional conduct, exclusion from critical meetings despite role requirements, morale issues within the marksmanship division, and a workplace environment that prioritized performative authority over mission effectiveness. I included dates. I included witnesses. I described the impact on unit cohesion, on junior officer development, on the willingness of qualified personnel to remain in their positions. I wrote it the way I'd write any report, clear, factual, supported by evidence. And then I routed it through the proper channels. The Inspector General called 3 weeks later. I was in my office when the phone rang, and when I saw the extension on the caller ID, I knew exactly what it meant. The IG doesn't call to say hello. Major Stone, this is Colonel Mitchell from the Inspector General's office. I'd like to schedule a time to speak with you regarding your readiness review submission. My pulse kicked up, but my voice stayed level. Of course, sir. I'm available at your convenience. We set a time for the following week. When I hung up, I sat there staring at the phone for a long moment, feeling the weight of what I'd just set in motion. I'd followed the chain of command. I'd documented everything. I'd done it by the book, the way they taught you in officer training, the way the system was supposed to work. But I also knew how these things actually worked. How reporting up could mark you as a troublemaker, how being right didn't always protect you from the fallout. I'd seen officers sidelined for less. I'd seen careers stall because someone made the mistake of pointing out that the emperor had no clothes. Still, I didn't regret it. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I couldn't keep absorbing the dysfunctionality as a senior officer. His jaw tightened. For a long moment, he just stared at me, and I could see him deciding how to play this. He couldn't yell, not anymore. Not when the IG was involved. He couldn't dismiss it. So he did the only thing left. He tried to make me feel small. You've made a lot of noise for someone who's supposed to be a team player, he said quietly. You do understand that this doesn't just affect me. It affects everyone in this unit. You're dragging people's names through the mud because you couldn't handle a little ribbing. There it was. The reframe. The suggestion that I was the problem, that my unwillingness to tolerate disrespect was the real dysfunction, not the disrespect itself. I'd heard this script before. I'd heard it my whole career in different forms from different people. You're too sensitive. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You're hurting the team. But I wasn't the same officer I'd been 6 months ago. I wasn't the same person who'd laughed along, who'd minimized, who'd told herself that endurance was strength. With respect, sir, I said, I documented conduct. Not personality. Not opinions. Conduct. If that conduct reflects poorly on anyone, that's not my responsibility to manage. He didn't have a response to that. Or maybe he did, but he was smart enough not to say it out loud. You're dismissed, Major. I saluted. He returned it, barely. I walked out of his office and didn't look back. The fallout was quiet, but visible. Over the next few weeks, Colonel Whitaker's role in the training initiative was reduced. Briefings that used to go through him were reassigned. Meetings he used to lead were handed to other senior officers. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would show up in official records as a reprimand, just a slow, deliberate marginalization. His tone, when I saw him in passing, was brittle. Professional, but cold. Like I'd betrayed him, rather than held him accountable. But something else started to happen too. People met my eyes when I entered a room. Junior officers started coming to me with questions they used to take elsewhere. I was invited to planning sessions I hadn't been included in before. I wasn't looking for revenge. I never had been. I was looking for order. For a system that actually worked the way it was supposed to, where competence mattered more than performance, where the rules applied to everyone. And for the first time in years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, that was possible. One evening, about a month after the IG interview, Captain Chen stopped by my office again. She knocked, waited for me to wave her in, and closed the door behind her. Ma'am, I just wanted to say, thank you. I looked up from the report I'd been reviewing. For what? For filing the complaint. For not letting it go. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I know it cost you. But it mattered. To a lot of us, it mattered. I didn't know what to say to that. So I just nodded. There are more of us than you think, she continued. People who see what's happening, who are tired of pretending it's normal. And now it feels like maybe we don't have to pretend anymore. After she left, I sat there in the quiet and thought about what she'd said. About the cost. About what mattered. It had cost me. Not in rank or assignment, I was still a major, still in my position. But it had cost me the illusion that staying quiet would protect me. It had cost me the belief that competence alone would be enough. It had cost me the comfort of neutrality. But neutrality isn't safety. It's just a slower kind of compromise. I thought about the trainees on the range, watching. I thought about Captain Chin and all the other junior officers who were learning what leadership looked like, not from the rhetoric, but from the example. I thought about the culture I wanted to build. One where you didn't have to be twice as good just to be seen as adequate. Where professionalism meant mutual respect, not endurance. Where calling out dysfunction wasn't betrayal, it was integrity. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started drafting a proposal for revised leadership training standards. Not because anyone had asked me to, but because I could. Because I had the rank, the expertise, and now, finally, the credibility to make people listen. The work became my statement. Every policy memo, every training reform, every standard I updated was an unspoken answer to that question Colonel Whitaker had asked on the range. Who are you? I'm the officer who doesn't flinch. I'm the one who holds the line. I'm the one who believes the system can work, but only if we make it. Within 6 months, Colonel Whitaker was transferred to a training command in South Carolina. The official memo called it routine rotation in support of professional development objectives. The kind of language that sounds neutral on paper, but everyone knows how to read between the lines. Unofficially, everyone knew. Transfers like that, mid-cycle, to a training command rather than an operational unit, were rarely voluntary. They were the military's way of moving problems without creating scandals. Quietly removing someone from a position of authority while maintaining the appearance of normal career progression. I heard about it through the grapevine before the official announcement came down. Master Sergeant Barnes stopped by my office, closed the door, and said simply, "Whitaker's out. Effective next month." I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired. "How's the unit taking it?" I asked. Barnes shrugged. "Mixed. Some people think it's overdue. Some think it's unfair. Most are just trying to figure out what it means for them." That was the truth of it. Culture doesn't change because one person leaves. It changes because the people who remain decide to build something different. 2 months after Whitaker's transfer, I was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. 05. My first command. The ceremony was small, professional. My parents flew in from Oregon. A few colleagues attended. The base commander pinned the silver oak leaf on my uniform and shook my hand, and that was it. I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force. But what mattered more than the rank was the assignment. I was given command of the Advanced Marksmanship Training Program. The same range where I'd been humiliated was now under my oversight. I walked onto that range on my first day as commander and stood there for a moment, looking downrange at the targets. The wind was blowing, kicking up dust, and the morning sun was just starting to burn off the chill. Everything looked exactly the same tower, the same firing line, the same concrete and steel and sand. But it felt different. Because this time, I wasn't proving I belonged. I was defining what belonging meant. I changed the culture immediately. Not dramatically, not with grand speeches or sweeping mandates. Just consistently, deliberately, one decision at a time. I implemented blind performance reviews where evaluators didn't know the shooter's name or gender until after scoring. I revised the qualification standards to focus on tactical application rather than parade ground precision. I created a mentorship program that paired experienced shooters with newer ones, regardless of rank or gender. When young officers, men and women, came through the program, I made sure they understood that competence was the only currency that mattered here. Not bravado. Not performance. Not who could talk the loudest or joke the hardest. Just skill, discipline, and the willingness to improve. I told them what no one had told me, that being underestimated isn't a reflection of your ability. It's a test of your resolve. And the best response isn't anger or defensiveness, it's precision. One afternoon, about 4 months into my command, I was observing a qualification run when I noticed one of the trainees, a young woman, maybe 23, second lieutenant fresh out of the academy, struggling with her grouping. Her shots were consistent but pulling left. I walked over, waited for her to finish her magazine, then said, "Mind if I take a look at your stance?" She straightened immediately. "No, ma'am." I had her run through her pre-fire routine while I watched. The problem was subtle. She was anticipating the recoil, tensing her shoulder just before the trigger break, which was pulling her aim off center. "You're fighting the weapon," I said. "Let it do what it's designed to do. You just guide it." She adjusted, fired again. The next 3 rounds were center mass. "Better," I said. "Keep that feeling. That's what right looks like." She nodded, and I could see the relief in her face. Not just because she'd fixed the technical problem, but because she'd been corrected without being diminished. Because someone had seen her mistake as a learning opportunity rather than proof of inadequacy. That's what I wanted every interaction to feel like. Not perfect, perfection isn't the goal. But fair. Clear. Based on performance, not perception. The work became my statement. Every policy memo I wrote was deliberate. Every training standard I revised was an answer to the question of what leadership should look like. Not command through intimidation, but through clarity. Not authority through performance, but through competence. I didn't talk about Colonel Whitaker. I didn't need to. The program I was building was a repudiation of everything his leadership had represented. It was proof that you could maintain standards without cruelty, that you could demand excellence without humiliation, that respect and discipline weren't mutually exclusive. One evening, I was working late in my office when Captain Chin knocked on the doorframe. She'd been promoted recently, newly pinned 03, and she'd requested assignment to the marksmanship program. "Ma'am, you have a minute?" "Always." "Come in." She sat down, and I could tell she had something on her mind. "I wanted to ask you something," she said. "About what happened with Colonel Whitaker." I waited. "Do you think it was worth it?" she asked. Filing the complaint, going through all of that, knowing what it cost. I thought about that for a moment. About the meetings I'd been excluded from after the investigation started. About the whispers, the sideways glances, the way some people had started treating me like I was fragile or vindictive or both. About the nights I'd sat in this same office wondering if I'd just ended my own career. "Yes," I said. Because the alternative was staying silent. And silence has a cost too. You just don't see it on paper. She nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to understand that." "Good," I said. "Because you're going to face that choice too at some point. Maybe not the same situation, but the same question. Do you speak up, or do you go along? And the answer you give will define the kind of officer you become." After she left, I sat there in the quiet and thought about legacy. About what we leave behind when we're gone. Not just in official records or promotion rates, but in the people we teach, the standards we set, the culture we choose to build or tolerate. I thought about that day on the range. The way Colonel Whitaker had looked at me after I'd put every round down range in 12 seconds. The way he'd asked, "Who are you?" Like he didn't know. Like he'd never really looked. And I realized now that his question had been wrong. It wasn't who are you, it was who do you choose to be when no one's watching, when it's easier to stay quiet, when speaking up might cost you everything you've worked for. That's the question that matters. And the answer isn't something you say once. It's something you live every day, in every decision, in every interaction. I was the officer who didn't flinch. Not because I was fearless, but because I'd learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. The range lights clicked off automatically at 2200 hours, and I packed up my things and walked out into the night air. Tomorrow, I'd be back. And the day after that. Building something better, one decision at a time. That was the work. And it was enough. 2 years later, I ran into Colonel Whitaker at a Pentagon briefing on Joint Service Training Initiatives. I saw him before he saw me, standing near the coffee station in his service dress uniform, looking older than I remembered. Smaller, somehow. The way people do when the context changes and they're no longer the largest presence in the room. I could have avoided him. The room was crowded enough, the briefing generic enough, that we could have existed in the same space without ever acknowledging each other. But something in me didn't want to. Not out of spite or a need for confrontation, I'd moved past that. I just didn't want to carry the weight of avoidance anymore. So when the briefing ended and people started filtering out, I walked over. Colonel Whitaker. He turned, and I saw the recognition flash across his face. For just a second, something shifted in his expression, surprise, maybe, or discomfort. But then his training kicked in, and he extended his hand. Lieutenant Colonel Stone. He glanced at my rank insignia, and I saw him register the change. Colonel Stone now, I see. Congratulations. We shook hands. His grip was firm but not aggressive. Professional. Thank you, sir. There was a pause, the kind that happens when two people who share a complicated history stand in a neutral space and try to figure out what to say. Around us, other officers were talking, laughing, making plans for lunch. Normal Pentagon noise. I heard about your command, he said finally. The marksmanship program. Word is you turned it into one of the best training pipelines in the Air Force. We have good people, I said. Good instructors, good standards. It's a team effort. He nodded, and something in his face softened slightly. I also heard you implemented some new policies. Blind evaluations, revised qual standards. That was smart. It wasn't an apology. But it was something. An acknowledgement, maybe. A recognition that what I'd built mattered, that the work I'd done after he left had been more than just reaction, it had been construction. I had good teachers, I said evenly. Some taught me what to do. Others taught me what not to do. Both kinds of lessons are valuable. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. He understood what I was saying, and he understood I was saying it without malice. Just truth. Fair enough. He paused, then added, for what it's worth, I think you're doing good work. The Air Force needs more officers like you. I looked at him, really looked at him, and tried to find the anger I'd carried for so long. The resentment, the bitterness, the need for him to fully understand what his behavior had cost. But it wasn't there anymore. Or maybe it was, but it had transformed into something else. Something quieter and more useful. Thank you, I said. That means something. We stood there for another moment, and I realized this was as close to closure as we were ever going to get. He wasn't going to apologize for the jokes, the exclusion, the mockery. He wasn't going to admit that his leadership had been flawed or that I'd been right to report him. Maybe he didn't even fully believe those things. Maybe in his version of the story, he was the victim of political correctness, of a system that had turned on him for no good reason. But his version didn't matter anymore. Not to me. Because I'd built something that spoke louder than any apology could. I'd taken the dysfunction I'd experienced and used it as a blueprint for what not to do. I'd transformed pain into policy, frustration into standards, and personal experience into institutional change. That was my answer. Not what I said to him in that Pentagon hallway, but what I'd done in the 2 years since he'd left. Take care of yourself, Colonel, I said. You too, Colonel Stone. We shook hands again, not out of reconciliation exactly, but completion. The acknowledgement that we'd both moved on, that we existed now in different spheres, that whatever had happened between us was history rather than present tense. I walked away and didn't look back. Outside, the late afternoon sun was bright and warm. I had 30 minutes before my next meeting, so I walked around the Pentagon courtyard, letting my mind settle. I thought about that moment on the range, the one that had started all of this. The humiliation, the 12 seconds of perfect shooting, the silence after the last round. I thought about Colonel Whitaker's question, "Who are you?" At the time, I'd answered with my role, your range safety officer. It was a deflection, a way to maintain professionalism in a moment that felt anything but professional. But now, 2 years later, with the clarity that only distance provides, I knew the real answer. I was the officer who'd been underestimated and had chosen precision over anger. I was the officer who'd documented patterns instead of staying silent. I was the officer who'd filed a complaint knowing it might cost me everything, because integrity mattered more than comfort. I was the officer who'd taken command of a program and rebuilt it from the ground up, not to prove anything to anyone, but because it was the right thing to do. I was the officer who didn't need Colonel Whitaker's respect anymore because I'd earned my own. That was the answer. Not just his question, but to all the questions I'd been asking myself for years. About whether I belonged, whether I was good enough, whether the work was worth it. The answer was yes. But not because anyone had given me permission. Because I'd claimed it. Because I'd done the work, held the line, and refused to let other people's limitations become my own. I checked my watch and headed back inside for my next meeting. There was always another meeting, another briefing, another decision to make. That was the job. And I was good at it. Not for someone my size. Not for a woman. Not with qualifications and caveats. Just good. And that finally was enough. Now, as a colonel at 46, I still remember that day at the range. Not every day, I don't carry it like a wound anymore. But sometimes, when I'm observing qualification runs or reviewing performance reports or mentoring a young officer who's struggling with the same questions I struggled with, it comes back. Not the humiliation. That part has faded, lost its sharp edges, become just another data point in a long career. What I remember is the silence after the last shot. The way the range went quiet. The way sound itself seemed to hold its breath. That moment taught me what leadership really is. It's not the loudest voice in the room. It's not the person who can make others laugh or intimidate or perform. Leadership is composure under mockery, precision under pressure, grace under exposure. It's the ability to be underestimated and not let that change who you are or what you're capable of. It's the choice to document rather than tolerate, to build rather than destroy, to teach rather than diminish. I've been a colonel for 3 years now. Oh, 6, the same rank Whitaker held when I met him. The irony isn't lost on me. But where his leadership was about performance, about maintaining an image, about reminding people of his authority, mine is about standards. About creating systems that outlast any individual personality. I command a training wing now, overseeing multiple programs across 3 bases. It's administrative as much as operational, which means a lot of meetings, a lot of paperwork, a lot of decisions that affect hundreds of people I'll never meet personally. But I make those decisions with the same principle I used when I rebuilt the marksmanship program: competence over persona, skill over swagger, fairness over favoritism. I make sure that performance reviews are based on measurable outcomes, not subjective impressions. I make sure that promotion recommendations are supported by documentation, not by who plays golf with whom. I make sure that when someone reports misconduct, they're taken seriously rather than dismissed as oversensitive or vindictive. I can't change the entire military culture. I'm not naive enough to think one colonel can undo decades of institutional patterns. But I can change my corner of it. And I can teach the officers under my command to do the same when they move on to their own commands. That's how culture shifts, not through mandates from the top, but through consistent choices made by people in positions of authority who decide that the old way isn't good enough anymore. Last month, I gave a keynote address at the Air Force Academy. They asked me to speak about leadership and resilience, and I told them the story. Not all of it, I left out names, softened some of the details. But I told them about being mocked on a range, about the choice to respond with precision rather than anger, about the cost and value of speaking up. The question isn't whether you'll face moments like this, I told them. The question is what you'll do when you do. Will you stay silent to protect yourself? Will you laugh along to fit in? Or will you hold the line, even when it costs you? I saw some of them nodding. Some of them looked skeptical. They were young, still optimistic, still believing that competence would be enough to protect them. I'd been that young once. I didn't begrudge them the optimism. But I also saw a few who understood immediately. The women, mostly, but not exclusively. The ones who'd already learned that the world judges them differently, that their mistakes carry more weight, that their successes are more easily dismissed. Those were the ones I was really talking to. After the speech, a young cadet approached me, a woman, maybe 21, with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. "Ma'am, that story you told. Did it really happen like that?" "Yes." "And you really put every target down in 12 seconds?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, processing. "What did it feel like?" In that moment, I thought about that. About the heat in my chest, the weight of the rifle, the silence of the range. About the choice I'd made to step to the line instead of refusing, to answer with action instead of words. It felt like deciding, I said. Deciding who I was going to be. Whether I was going to let someone else define me, or whether I was going to define myself. She smiled slightly. And you chose yourself. I chose precision, I corrected gently. Because that was the one thing I could control. I couldn't control what he thought of me. I couldn't control whether people laughed. But I could control where my rounds went. And sometimes, that's enough. She thanked me and walked away, and I watched her go with the same feeling I got whenever I saw young officers coming up through the ranks, hope mixed with concern. Hope that they'd be better than we were, that they'd build on what we'd started. Concern that they'd face the same battles we did, that progress was slower than it should be. But that's the work. Teaching the next generation. Building systems that protect them better than we were protected. Creating a culture where competence is enough, where you don't have to be twice as good just to be seen as adequate. Some nights, I sit in my office, bigger now, with windows and a view of the flight line, and think about Colonel Whitaker. About where he is now, what he's doing, whether he ever thinks about that day on the range. I don't hate him. I did for a while. But hatred is exhausting, and I had better things to do with my energy. Now I just see him as a product of his time, his training, his own limitations. He was a good tactician. He understood strategy, logistics, operational planning. But he never understood people. He never understood that leadership isn't about demonstrating your own competence, it's about enabling others to demonstrate theirs. That's the difference between us. That's what I learned from him, even if he never meant to teach it. Whitaker's question, "Who are you?" still echoes sometimes, usually in quiet moments, usually when I'm making a decision that will affect people's careers or lives. It's become a touchstone for me. A reminder to check my own behavior, to make sure I'm leading the way I believe leadership should look. And the answer remains the same. I'm the officer who doesn't flinch. Not because I'm unaffected. Not because criticism or mockery or doubt don't land. They do. But because I've learned that flinching isn't the same as feeling. You can feel everything, the anger, the frustration, the hurt, and still choose precision. Still choose composure. Still choose to hold the line. That's what I tell the young officers who come to me for advice, who are struggling with their own versions of that moment on the range. I tell them that being professional doesn't mean being emotionless. It means choosing your response deliberately instead of reactively. I tell them that documentation is more powerful than confrontation, that systems are more lasting than personalities, that culture changes one decision at a time. I tell them that when someone says, "Show us what you've got," the answer isn't in what you say. It's in what you do. And it's in what you build after the moment passes. Because 12 seconds on a range didn't change anything. Not really. What changed things was the 2 years of work that followed. The complaints filed, the standards revised, the culture rebuilt. That's what mattered. That's what lasted. The range was just the moment people remember. The story they tell. But the real work, the work that actually made a difference, happened in offices and meetings and policy memos. It happened in the quiet, unglamorous grind of institutional change. That's leadership. Not the dramatic moments, but the consistent ones. Not the speeches, but the systems. Not the performance, but the follow-through. I'm 46 now. A colonel. I've served for 24 years. I've been deployed 4 times, commanded 3 different units, mentored dozens of officers, and written hundreds of reports and policies and directives. And when I think about my legacy, about what I'll leave behind when I retire, I don't think about that day on the range. I think about the second lieutenant who learned she could correct her stance without being diminished. I think about the policies that ensure blind evaluations. I think about the young officers who saw that speaking up was possible and chose to do it themselves. I think about the culture I helped build. Imperfect, still evolving, but better than what was there before. That's the answer to Whitaker's question. That's who I am. I'm the officer who doesn't flinch. Because when they say, "Show us what you've got," I already know. Years pass differently in uniform. You measure them not by birthdays, but by assignments, by the faces that cycle through your command, by the slow accumulation of experience that eventually hardens into wisdom. At 51, I find myself in a role I never quite imagined, Deputy Commander of Air Education and Training Command, overseeing officer development programs across the entire Air Force. It's been 5 years since I pinned on Colonel, and the Pentagon rumors suggest there's a star in my future. Brigadier General. Oh, 7. The possibility sits in my mind like something fragile that I'm afraid to examine too closely. Last week, I testified before a Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Military Culture and Retention. They wanted to know why qualified officers were leaving at higher rates than expected, why women and minorities were underrepresented in senior leadership, why surveys kept showing persistent problems with workplace climate. I sat at that witness table in my service dress uniform, looking at a row of senators who'd never spent a day in uniform, and I told them the truth. Not the sanitized version we usually offer Congress, the carefully worded testimonies that acknowledge problems without admitting fault. I told them about systems that protect performers over competence, about informal networks that determine who gets opportunities, about the gap between official policy and actual practice. One senator, a woman from the Midwest, asked me directly, "Colonel Stone, in your 29 years of service, have you personally experienced the kind of discrimination you're describing?" The room went quiet. My public affairs escort shifted uncomfortably in his seat behind me. I could have deflected. Could have said something about not speaking to personal experiences, about focusing on systemic issues rather than individual anecdotes. That would have been safer. Easier. Instead, I said, "Yes, Senator. I have." I told them about being a major who'd been mocked in front of 60 people for no reason except that someone in authority thought it would be funny. I told them about filing a complaint and watching my career hold its breath while the investigation played out. I told them about taking command and realizing that leadership meant building something better, not just surviving something broken. The hearing made news. Not major headlines, but enough that my phone started ringing. Old colleagues reaching out to say they'd watched the testimony, that it resonated, that they'd experienced similar things. A few were critical, said I was airing dirty laundry, making the Air Force look bad, hurting recruitment. But more were grateful. Grateful that someone had said it out loud, at that level, in that forum. Grateful that the story was finally being told by someone who'd stayed in, who'd made it work, who could prove that speaking up didn't have to mean the end of your career. My aide, Captain Marcus Webb, brought me coffee the morning after the testimony and said, "Ma'am, my sister is at the academy. She texted me last night. Said half her classmates watched your testimony in the common room. What did they think?" He smiled. "They think you're a badass, ma'am." Her word, not mine. I laughed to spite myself. "Tell your sister to focus on her studies." But later, alone in my office, I thought about those cadets watching. Thought about what it meant that they'd seen someone at my level, with my rank, say publicly what so many had only whispered privately. Representation matters. Not just having women or minorities in the ranks, but having them visible, having them lead, having them speak truth without being destroyed for it. Last month, I was asked to chair a task force on leadership development. The Chief of Staff herself appointed me, which meant this wasn't some ceremonial assignment. It was real authority to examine and recommend changes to how we train, evaluate, and promote officers. My first meeting, I looked around the table at the other task force members, 3 colonels, 2 brigadier generals, a command chief master sergeant, and representatives from each major command. Good officers, all of them. But I noticed something that probably wouldn't have registered with me 20 years ago. I was the only woman. "Before we begin," I said, "I want to make sure we're hearing from the people who'll be most affected by whatever we recommend." That means junior officers, enlisted personnel, people at operational units who are living with current policies every day. I don't want this to be 10 senior leaders deciding what's best without input from the force. One of the generals nodded. Agreed. How do you suggest we structure that input? We spent the next hour designing a survey and focus group process that would actually reach people who might not otherwise speak up. We built in anonymity protections, multiple feedback channels, and a commitment to publish all findings, not just the convenient ones. That night, driving home from the Pentagon, I thought about how different this felt from that staff meeting years ago where I'd watched my analysis get delegated to someone else. How strange it was to be the person chairing the meeting, setting the agenda, deciding whose voices mattered. Power doesn't just change what you can do. It changes what you're responsible for doing. I think about Second Lieutenant Stone sometimes, that 22-year-old who thought qualification scores would be enough, who believed the system was essentially fair, who hadn't yet learned that competence and recognition aren't the same thing. I think about what I would tell her if I could. Maybe this: everything you're afraid of will happen. You will be underestimated, dismissed, mocked. You will work twice as hard for half the credit. You will file a complaint that makes people uncomfortable, and some of them will never forgive you for it. But you'll survive. More than survive, you'll build something. You'll take the dysfunction you experience and transform it into policy, the frustration into standards, the pain into purpose. You'll make it so the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles quite as hard. And one day, you'll sit in front of Congress and tell your story without flinching, without apologizing, without minimizing. You'll say exactly what happened, and why it mattered, and what needs to change. And they'll listen. Because you'll have earned the rank that makes them listen. Not by staying quiet, not by going along, but by holding the line when it cost you everything to do it. My daughter called last night. She's 17, starting to think about college, about what comes after. "Mom," she said, "I watched your testimony. My government teacher showed it in class." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. "What did you think?" Long pause. Then, "I think I understand now why you work so much. Why you care about this stuff. Yeah. You're not just doing a job. You're fixing things that are broken." After we hung up, I sat there in the dark, turned it into a career of purpose. I'm the officer who proved that precision matters more than performance. I'm the officer who doesn't flinch. And I'm just getting started. Thanks for watching. If this hit home, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder to hold the line. Drop your story below. I read the comments. Questions for you. Have you ever been mocked publicly and had to prove yourself on the spot? What's your 12-second moment when precision spoke louder than words? When did you realize professionalism without boundaries is just endurance? If you filed a complaint or set a hard boundary, was it worth the cost? How do you make sure competence, not swagger, sets the tone on your team? Tag a friend who's been underestimated. Your voice might be the nudge they need.